Greetings again, Tubaneros. The Zimmerman verdict is old news by now. Every pundit worth his punctuation has articulated his points on the legality of the actors and their actions and the social implications of the verdict. The latter is tied into the racial divides of America, the lingering heritage of Jim Crow, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying this is wrong, but let's take a longer view. The same folks who encouraged George Zimmerman to stand his ground feel themselves beleaguered by dark, sinister forces of whom a black teenager in a hoodie is a convenient symbol. These are the same persons and groups behind immigration reform, that is, restriction, and voting reform, that is, disfranchisement, and Obama bashing, that is, fear of a black president, and anti-Sharia laws, meaning fear of any God not made in their own image. And for that matter, fear of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction abroad. The paranoia behind George Zimmerman is the paranoia of a George Bush in microcosm, with whole nations and peoples, like Iraq, becoming a projected collective Trayvon needing a put-down in their place. All of these are components of a mosaic of reaction, of a majority population that feels it's losing control. Our country is no longer our country. And this is by no means new. A century and more ago, the U.S. was inundated by newcomers from Palermo and Warsaw and Dublin who threatened our values, our traditions, our way of life. Their children would be nothing but cultural bastards with no roots in their native cultures or the Anglo-Saxon traditions of colonial America and the Founding Fathers, and the whole American Republic would choke in putrid degeneration or crumble under race war and social insurrection. The Jim Crow laws of the southern and border states were pushed at this very time in the name of reform. Voting restrictions were enacted at the same time to reform the polls and cut down alleged fraud by people too ignorant to deserve democratic participation. Along with this came grassroots social engineering projects, literally called bulldozing, that ethnically cleansed black minority populations from wide swaths of white majority southern communities. As I'm sure you're aware that for all of this, the feared collapse did not happen. The American federal state of the 1890s did not go the way of the Yugoslav Federation of the 1990s. And there is no evidence that the rearguard actions of the 1890s played any role in this preservation. In fact, the overwhelming body of evidence shows that the newcomers willingly integrated into a strong national state and culture without needing organic genetic links to old traditions, and thereby recreating the society in which they lived. Immigrants from Palermo became not New Englanders, but Americans who happened to live in Boston, and put a larger identity before a regional, traditional one. This is what the native Yankee population feared most, that they are going to vote us out of town and take over. We would lose control of our own town and then our own country. The idea that the community, in either the local or national sense, was larger than themselves alone, that it could belong to those others as well, that common ground could be found, was as foreign to their taste as lasagna on their dinner tables. The American Republic survived precisely because it did not surrender to parochialism, to the fear of threatened old elites who would destroy democracy to save it from the barbarians across the tracks. I do know one way to ensure that the American Republic collapses and goes the way of federal Yugoslavia, and that is through decades of coddling tribal fears, encouraging secessionist fantasies, enacting reactionary impulses into law precisely to be discriminatory, precisely because they're unfair, because it's the only way to keep your ever-narrowing margin of power. So Trayvon Martin's death becomes not just a symbol of American race history, but an act of retrograde backlash by those fearing loss of status and loss of control. As in Boston, Sacco and Vanzetti were a social sacrifice for the same reasons a century ago, and yet the U.S. has survived. Not because two immigrants were railroaded to their death for their foreign ideas, but because the social fears of those executing them were divorced from reality. Because those charged with holding society together had a larger vision than the bigots of Boston. The answer is thus not less openness, but more. More democratic transformation, more demographic transformation, more redefinition of America by new settlers, by forcing not the foreigners but the natives to assimilate into core values of inclusion, openness, with freedom and justice for all. Damn, that was a strange knock on the tube line. Maybe it's bugged. Hello, who is it? Former President of the American Republic, George Bush Jr.? Well, what's shaking, W? Fleeing bull down at the ranch for a change? Do what? You take exception to my comparing the killing of Trayvon Martin to your invading Iraq? Of comparing Christian citizens preserving their culture and heritage to a self-important little security guard? that being American is a privilege, not a right, that one has to be worthy of. Well, can you really find examples to support that in the Constitution you swore to uphold? Because unfortunately it's a very liberal and socially inclusive document. Although it's true, penned in longhand by dead white men from another age. Maybe they didn't understand what being American really meant, huh? Or maybe Christian America just needs a good dose of assimilation and public education itself. So that's why you want to destroy it.